right, our next speaker is Dr. Nicole Anderson, and I'll let her introduce her talk.
Okay, thank you so much, Shauna. Down is up. We'll get that by noon. So as she mentioned, I'm Nicole Anderson. So if Courtney's cattle are king of Texas, then our horses are probably the official pastime of Texas. So I'm actually up at Texas Tech University. So if you're not familiar with Texas, Texas Tech University is actually up in Lubbock, and then I'm actually at the School of Veterinary Medicine, which we just started in 2021. So I'm actually up in Amarillo. So if you remember her map where she's talked about Bushland, Bushland is, I guess, if you will, a suburb of Amarillo, as much as suburbs exist of Amarillo. So we are easily 8 hours apart. So I'm essentially in another state from Courtney. But regardless, always nice to kind of help represent the agriculture of Texas. So what I'm going to talk about is equine welfare today. So, you know, we have many similarities in kind of thinking about the lives of horses and some of the things that they go through for welfare. What we don't have is kind of the most robust experimental design options in horses. So as we think about equine welfare, where we really need to just start is figuring out what even exists in the literature. And that's kind of where I'm going to be a little bit today. If it's not, I can tab. Down is, I'm hitting my down. That's fine. I'll tab. No, it doesn't matter. It's fine. I just want to make sure I'm not double miking myself. Look at it. So why should we ultimately care about horse or equine welfare in this world? So horses have pretty long lives. Unlike many of our production species, they are living out usually a full life cycle. And so we are looking at an animal that can live for easily 30 plus years. So there are situations for health reasons, they might get euthanized early, but that's usually the only reason in the United States that we give them an early end of life. So we're talking about a very long living mammalian species that we're trying to manage. And similar to, you know, Dr. Daigle's cattle, our horses are going to go under multiple ownership. If you are the rare horse that's actually foaled out all the way the rest of your life at one facility, congratulations. But typically, if you're not used to horses, you're going to foal out at a breeding facility. And then you're going to go to probably a trainer for some of your initial life handling. So you might go there anywhere as young as 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, till you're 3, 4, depending on the industry you're at. Then you're going to probably move into kind of whatever your job's going to be. Typically, it's high performance. You'll stay there until basically you can't do the job. That could be as much as young as 8 years old. It could be 10 years old. It could be 15. Then you're going to probably go into some sort of a lesson program or become some, as we call them, little girl's horse, right? Like the little dream horse. That's going to be somewhere from 15 to 20, 25 years of age. And then if you're lucky enough, you might go to a retirement facility or just also live out your days somewhere until you finally reach, you know, your final age in life. And so what we're looking at with these horses is obviously lots of different management changes. We're also looking at most of these horses are going to do some sort of high performance at some point in their life. Most people, when you are buying a young horse, usually it's because you have a goal for them to do some sort of performance. That could be jumping, dressage, working cattle, which can be quite demanding, maybe racehorse industry, it can be reining, whatever. And so they are not a federally regulated species the way we have with some of our cattle. You know, they don't have quite the markets to track their cost. We can kind of look at the health sector, and we do see, you know, based on what companies reporting it, we're looking at a $1 to $2.5 billion industry in that horse health. So though we're not we don't have, like I said, some of that money exchanging based around like carcasses and stuff, there's still a substantial amount of money, of course, going around horses. And if any of you have ever owned a horse or had somebody in your life who wanted a horse, usually one of those first conversations is, how are we going to afford this, right? Because you're not going to make money probably on that horse. And so the first thing I always get when I'm talking about horse welfare, the first thing everyone asks me is, well, is it a livestock or is it a pet? And that seems to be an important deciding factor. And that's something that makes it unique, is sometimes we're talking about them as a livestock. So we're talking about them on a whole herd level. We're thinking about how the entire group is being managed. And then sometimes we get deep in this horse-human interaction. And so I'm going to give you the best answer I have found thus far to this question, which is still not entirely clear. But the Farm Bill basically of 2018 removes the language of horses as pets. So I tried looking at the Farm Bill. You know, that's definitely something we can ask a future speaker to help me interpret the entire Farm Bill on where horses are. But what I see is there's some language that says pets, horses, and livestock. But I understand that now horses can qualify for some of the livestock aids that exist. So they are now becoming kind of officially maybe livestock and not pets in the US system. But regardless, no matter how they're classified, that's not going to change how management works. Management didn't suddenly say these are now livestock, we're going to manage them as a whole herd. We are still looking at animals being managed based on what they're doing or how it's going. So how do we think about welfare? Because I already said sometimes we have individuals, sometimes we have groups. We go through lots of life stages. What do we do? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, here we go. So how do we measure horse welfare? So if you are familiar with the 5 domains model, we talk about this a lot. We think about how the nutrition of the animal, the environment of the animal, their physical health and their behavior tie into their mental or emotional status. And all of these are important. All of these are relevant. I would say when I'm looking through the data, it seems like what's sifting up is an emphasis on the environment of the horses and the natural behavior of the horses. We do a lot of stuff relevant to the behavior. There is certainly a whole world of nutrition out there. If I wanted to do nutrition, I'd become a nutritionist. So that's a little bit less in my wheelhouse. And physical health, really, we talk about only when something's going wrong. And so it seems like to be on the proactive side, we need to think about that environment. I get excited and then I got to remember to breathe. Okay. So how can we think about this horse welfare? A common approach is to dive in at a discipline level that gives us some sort of measure to sort the horses. We are still talking about massive age ranges, breed differences. We typically can't control for a lot of that, but at least gives us something to pinpoint. So if Shauna can order chickens of similar genetic stock and Courtney can at least get them of the same breed, I just show up and hope that there's at least 10 horses in this space that are available for me to look at. So that's kind of where we're at in horses. Yep. And I suppose I never said, so my background, I did lameness in dairy cattle. I never actually introduced myself. I just got excited about horses. And then my PhD was actually in sow piglet communication. So I am coming at it from a livestock lens because that is my background in welfare land. But I still think, it's all, of course, relevant. So here's a couple disciplines I'm going to call out because I see them come up a lot in the literature. If you are, I'm assuming, I don't know how many of you are dressage riders. I'm assuming very few. Otherwise, what would you do in Arkansas at a, food welfare conference? But dressage, we typically talk about tack placement, tack effects on the horse. And so what we are looking at is this head carriage. So if you look at our little diagrams, I think the mouse, yeah, you can see it. Good. So then the people online can see too. If we are looking at this would be kind of more optimal. So what we have is essentially a straight line of that face. This is a common practice in dressage, and it is suboptimal for the welfare of the horse. So this is called a roll curve. And so we can actually see it kind of presented here on this horse a little bit too. And this is a very common presentation. We see it like the Olympic levels. So this is a common thing. And so the question becomes, how does this pressure on the bit affect communication with the horse? And also, how does this affect the wind pathways, the breathing ability of that horse? And so what we see is that when horses are held in that roll curve, we have some behavioral indicators of stress. So we see ears back, head tossing, we see tail swishing, and then attempts at bucking. And so even if you know nothing about a horse, most of us know that with our animals, with our ears, our mammals, back ears are usually not a good thing. And I assume we all know that if a horse is bucking you off, you're probably not in a good spot either. So even with no knowledge about horses, we can say that's undesirable. And we can also even do preference testing. So they can train horses to learn that if they go to the left, for example, they might be put in a normal headset. To the right, they're going to be put in a roll curve, and they will actually show a preference. So we can ask horses some questions, again, based on their behavior and their performance. Another common discipline family of horses we look at is racehorses. We love a good racehorse study. Sorry, racehorses, you're often picked on. So if you aren't familiar with this, what you're looking at is a horse that's performing cribbing behavior. So what they'll do is they'll bite on a substrate. Typically it's wood, it's something soft, and they suck in air. The reason this is an issue is if you look at their teeth, they'll massively wear them down from that continual biting on wood. And often they'll typically ingest wood, which then leads to a colicking horse. Horses can't throw up, so that can be certainly a sign of death for horses. And so we tend to use racehorses for this model. So stereotypies are going to be indicators of potentially prolonged psychological distress in animals at some point in their lifetime. And so we look at these racehorses because they're typically stabled. And we think that horses typically unstabled are going to be under a stress situation. They have decreased socialization abilities, decreased movement, and decreased opportunities for forage. And so with limited outdoor spacing available and limited social bonding, we see that racehorses will do as much as 20 to 35% of this stereotypic behavior. And so just to give you a reference, typically when we're talking about stereotypies, we're talking about maybe 10% of a population, maybe 5. Most stabled horses, we're looking at maybe 15. So what we're looking at is at least a quarter of them are in some sort of severe prolonged psychological distress that they are finding coping mechanisms to handle it that can be actually eventually potentially deadly to the animal. We also look at eventing. Eventing is a popular one as well. These are at least also regulated at the federal levels for multiple countries and the US. And so typically when we look at eventing, we're looking at rider safety. And so eventing can include jumping. What we're usually looking at is those horses that go over the jumps that don't fall down. It's cross country. You know, if you have anything that you want to see in horses, this is the one to show up to. This is like the NASCAR of horseback riding a little bit. Everyone's like, oh, you know, and there's always a water jump and someone falls in the water. But in a more serious note, about a quarter of them as well, if the horse happens to rotate, the horse is going to end up with a broken leg, which is also a death sentence, or the rider is going to end up seriously injured. And there's helicopters standing by because this is one of your most dangerous events. On a side note, I broke my collarbone jumping a horse. Luckily, I didn't have a rotation, but I can tell you the whole time I fell, the data points were going through my head the whole time, thinking about my eventual demise. We can also look at bit lesions. So that gives us an indicator of kind of what that stress is like on the face of the horse, on the mouth of the horse. And at least half of them basically were resulting in lesions during eventing. So we can look at somewhat the physiology of the horse related to these discipline-specific events and kind of ask them what's going on. And interesting enough, they did some evaluations. So you have to do fitness to perform. Not any horse can just go out there. They will look for signs of evident lameness and fatigue. Those horses that were marked as fatigue actually resulted in a higher number of faults. Faults means that they're knocking down jumps or they are tripping kind of on the course. So a fatigued horse is not a good performance horse. And so we need these measures to tell us how these horses are performing before we get to the point that we have lesions, we have completely broken bones, or we're getting to kind of, again, these severe levels. So we can also think about horse welfare by situation. So we can go through the disciplines. Those are ones that are decently regulated, so we have good data on them, or some data. We can also think about situation. Interestingly enough, there's a substantial amount of data thinking about cold stress in horses, not heat stress. Horses can sweat, so we tend to be more interested in what's going on in the cold climates. And recently, increased interest has gone towards blanketing of horses. So when they're in cold environments, we tend to believe they need a blanket put on them. And so there's two things that they did. They've looked at the thermal temperature of these horses and found that in harsh weather, they will still seek out shelter, even with a blanket. So it tells us that shelters are pretty critical to that essential behaviors for horses. And then also they will choose to have a blanket put on them once it reaches 0 degrees Celsius. And so we can also, once again, by doing preference testing or training the horse can then essentially, they put up signs, the horse went and touched the sign with their nose, and the blanket either got put on or removed based on the environmental, in different environmental conditions. So the horses can actually select some things. And then lastly, sometimes we can measure by hood. It can be difficult, but We do see that horses that can undergo foraging, so have that outdoor access, and not just outdoor access, but opportunities to do essential natural behaviors in the environment, will have more social interactions and less aggression than those that we place under a barren lot. So even if they're outside without foraging, we're going to end up with a lot more fights. And then lastly, horses that are housed in a herd are going to certainly perform better on learning tasks. So we're going to have cognitive bias that's going to be improved if they have access to outdoors, if they have access to be social, to kind of learn from the conspecifics in their lifetime. So to go a little bit further into this herd, one thing, so thinking back to the fact that they undergo multiple management individuals and they may go through some big life changes. One thing we do see in horses is that also if we take away an opportunity to perform a behavior, or if we take away the opportunities for enrichment, things can actually get worse for them. So it's worse to have the toy and have it removed than to never known the toy at all, if you will. So what they did is they took 60 horses who were traditionally stabled and put them on pasture for 30 days. And then they pulled them back and returned them to the stalls. And they saw that those horses that got restalled had far more stereotypic behaviors upon returning than those that never got outdoor access and no change at all. So we see that horses, again, and we see this in other species as well, it's not unique to horses, but if we think about them going through multiple life stages, we also, though nobody measures it, there's likelihood of high stress going through those life changes, but nobody yet has really gotten to that point of measurement. We also saw, interesting enough, moving from pasture back inside, decreased gut mobility. Colic, again, can be deadly in a horse, so decreased gut activity could lead to colic, which could eventually, again, lead to a dead horse, or at least a minimum, and a very expensive veterinary bill. So a really common theme when I look at all of these, and that I can do with horses, is I think about the human interaction. All of our animals in any sort of confinement is managed by a human. So what I can think about is how is that human influencing the animal's quality of life? And with horses, we are typically handling them every single day in some capacity, whether that be for a turnout, for feeding, whatever. There's typically everyday activity. So we have a very high incidence of human handling on those horses compared to potentially some cattle who you might be out on range or some of our other species. And so we have this, like I said, important relationship. So let's talk for a minute about human-horse interaction. So horses have a pretty strong ability to perceive human behavior. And I say human behavior because we have data on that. There's some arguments that horses can sense our emotions. We have not been able to prove or disprove that true yet. So in the field of science, you know, it still lives in the realm of possibility, but I cannot support nor be unable to support that statement. So what we saw is that they took horses and they had two different feed buckets, and they introduced both feed buckets to the horse. One had feed and one did not. And so they put horses then in the arena with a human, and they said, what can they indicate based on what that human is doing? And so they used body direction, so facing the food. Head direction, just looking at the food, and eye direction. So they just kept solid and moved their eyes to the side. And they said, can the horses actually sense this and follow gaze? And what they saw is that in adult horses, they could do all of those tasks. So at better than chance, so over 50%, those horses could follow body direction, head direction, and eye gaze. So that's actually not something we've been able to show in a lot of species. It used to be believed only dogs could follow eye gaze. We're seeing that more animals can. And so we are certainly capable of now showing that in horses. They also tested it in juvenile horses. That was a subset of the study, and they saw that only body was useful. These were only a couple-year-old horses. So what all this leads to in this world is we have a world of equine-assisted services. And this is something that we have actually at Texas Tech University. We have an entire center for it. Some of you may have previously heard this called like therapy programs or horse therapy. It's undergone several names over the years. The current language is equine-assisted services. It's always kind of an evolution. And so what the point of equine assisted services is this is multiple different services which exist where professionals incorporate the horses and other equines to benefit the humans, to benefit the persons. We have substantial data that the impact to humans is quite high, whether it be physically, emotionally, psychologically, any of those things. What we don't have data on is how the horses are perceiving these sessions. And so in the US, we have about 8,000 horses in EAS with 66,000 people. So easily each horse is working with about maybe 5 people, maybe more, maybe less, to serve them and assist them. These are usually donated horses that came out of a high performance of some point, got adopted in. This is now, we always call it a second job for the horse. And again, all of our measures are human-centric. So all the things we have has to do with how, again, those humans are doing well, but we're looking at horses that maybe used to do dressage, used to do jumping, we're reining horses' performance, whatever, that are now being put into these systems. And the number 2 reasons that a horse gets pulled from a system, which they last less than 5 years, by the way, in equine assisted service programs, is either lameness, and we're talking about severe, unmanageable lameness that's probably going to result in death, or behavioral issues. And behavioral issues, I don't mean a horse that's not interested in walking forward when asked. These are horses that have multiple times bit handlers or are actively kicking other horses and humans during sessions. So what I think we have potentially found to understand is a potential system that exists for a high-stressed horse that may be in need of a welfare scientist to ask what's going on. And so that is what I'm doing a bit at Texas Tech University, is I'm trying to understand how are these horses perceiving our sessions and how can I help manage them. On the plus side, they are heard, so I can actually get a little bit more of them at a time, but it still provides some difficulties. So let's look at kind of a day in a session a little bit. And I want to specifically just zone us in on this horse. So what we see is that horses first off need to filter from a lot of different information. And so if we just look at first at the horse's body language and what they're communicating, I understand this is a static image, so this can be a little bit difficult, but what we're seeing is something that we would put on a grimace scale. So we have these grimace scales that help us understand if an animal is potentially in some sort of pain or distress. And if we look at the horse grimace scale, it's going to include these ears back, eye tightening, and usually a tightening of a muzzle, which this horse actually provides for us a pretty good example of that. Okay. And these horses there's really no regulations to them. They can work up to 6 hours a day in a session. They do need a day off every once in a while, but it's quite variable. Again, there isn't really regulations on these, so there's really not too much rules that are happening. Further, so we have this horse in the session. We have the rider, which is typically the only input you're going to get as a horse. So you're going to either have your rider or a handler in some way, and that is a one-to-one relationship. It's quite intimate. But this horse may have a rider on it who could hit them, who could be wiggling, who could be pulling on the reins or kicking. They're also going to have 2 sidewalkers. These are here for the rider's safety. They're going to usually hold on to the rider, or they're going to help kind of make sure that the rider stays steady, because we are working with riders that sometimes have some balance issues. And then we also have a front handler. And typically what we want is the horse to be paying attention to that handler. But if your entire life has been trained to teach you to pay attention to the rider, this can be confusing. And if you don't ride horses, a really well-trained horse, you should be able to almost just lean your weight and you can manipulate where that horse is going. So my hypothesis in my lab is that EAS is stressful to horses. And I want to make it clear that I'm in no way trying to shut down EAS. Thinking about the model of sustainability, I want these horses to be able to be doing well. To have a new horse have to come in every 3 to 5 years is incredibly costly to everyone involved. And I don't want an animal to get to the point that they feel like they have to bite to communicate that they are in a moment of stress. So that is my goal, is to try and understand where this stress is coming from and how we can help to alleviate it on these animals. So my PhD student did a systematic review looking at where we are so far on the literature and trying to figure out what is going on. And so that is, as I say, there's Bethany in the background. These next couple slides were courtesy of her. And so we're actually trying to do some thermal imaging on horses. There's some data that shows that eye temperature can be an indicator of stress. When you get stressed, the eye can be quite warm. We have had very mixed results with this, so I'm not talking about it too much. And it seems like talking to other researchers as well, we have quite mixed results with horses. So let's talk about the physiological indicators of stress that she's found so far in the literature. And I had to make myself a little note because she did a great job with arrows, but I don't always remember them all. So she did what's called a systematic review. I don't know how many of you are familiar with these. Instead of just doing a basically normal literature search, you have a structure to it. So that you're kind of using a scientific approach. So you come up with your aims. Hers were to compile literature regarding the physiological indicators of stress to better understand the welfare of our horses in EAS. She included, they need to be English, peer-reviewed journals investigating EAS and the effects of EAS on equine welfare. Her exclusion was anything that talked only about human effects, were basically based on equine sporting events, or they didn't mention equine welfare or stress in any capacity. And so her search terms, this is where I said it's gone under many names: equine-assisted services, equine-assisted therapies, equine-assisted activities, equine therapy, hippotherapy, bless you, adaptive riding, therapeutic riding, and it needs welfare and stress. And so these, like I said, have had many names over the years. And so what she had is her initial search yielded 1,100 papers. Before you get excited, 100 of those were duplicates. So she ended up with 980. And then when she actually read through those, she had over 900 to exclude. So we ended up with 33 where it went to full text assessment, where then we read the entire paper to see if it fit our aims. And we ended up with 19 papers. So in the last 100-ish years, we found 19 papers that have to do something with equine-assisted services and something related to horse welfare and or stress. So here's where she got us. So here's her results. 2 of the studies found absolutely no difference in the stress indicators that they used for physiology. 9 found no differences in heart rate, just simple heart rate. There was one that showed that heart rate just increased over the duration of the study. And there was one study that found heart rate to be higher in equine-assisted service horses than jumping horses. 4 studies found no differences in heart rate variability. So I know we have students and stuff in the room as well. So heart rate variability is looking at kind of the distance between the beats in heart rate. And so we see that to be a better measure of stress. Low heart rate variability means that the animal is more stressed or less able to handle stress. Higher heart rate variability is actually good. It means the system's primed and ready to receive stress and react to it. So she found that heart rate variability was lower during mounted and dismounted activities, or the dismounting phase, than actually during riding. So that's telling us that it's potentially more stressful when they're getting mounted and dismounted. She also found that heart rate variability is lower in equine-assisted service horses than dressage horses. And she also found that 5 studies reported no differences in any level of cortisol, with it being, though, higher in the anticipatory phase. So that would be right before tacking up and when entering the arena than during the actual sessions itself. So with that, she said that 58% of the authors overall conclude that EAS horses are not stressed at all. And so based on these 19 papers, you know, about 10 of them are saying that there's not a stress model in equine-assisted services. And some limitations, she said, you know, at least 74 of them have less than 10 horses on the study. Some of them could be as small as less than 5. So we're looking at very small sample sizes, which can be, you know, certainly difficult. And you're usually at one center. So you're really, are you just managing how they manage? Are you measuring how they manage? Or are you actually looking at equine-assisted services? And the methods that they used were very inconsistent. I asked her, I said, do you have any slides I can put up about behavior that was at least used so I can show kind of some of the ethograms? And she laughed at me and walked out of my office, which was totally fine in my lab, essentially meaning that the behavior is so across the board that she's like, I can't come up with a consistent ethogram for what we saw in these papers. And so an ethogram would be a list of behaviors that they saw. So when we do think about behavior, I was like, well, what do we have for stress? We have a really beautiful equine pain ethogram that's been developed by some vet schools. It's actually genuinely quite beautiful. They have a photo of every single behavior. They have a verbal description, a written description, and then they have a video that goes with it as well. So you can watch it occurring in the same environment, which is in a stall, again, over these horses, and they've got a good 60 plus behaviors. So if you want to do equine pain research, have I got the reference for you? That one exists. We've got it. It's beautiful. Now, pain is not the same thing as stress. And so stress, we do not have as well developed. We can think about these things like avoidance behaviors. We can think about maybe these abnormal behaviors, stereotypies like we saw maybe with some racehorses. We can always use cortisol. Anybody in this room that's done research that related to welfare has probably taken cortisol in some capacity. With horses, we have to come up with very non-adverse measures, which means I'm usually using salivary cortisol in some capacity. I don't often get to poke horses very much or at all. Heart rate variability are really nice ones. At least we can put a nice band on the horses and have it collect some data. And then we can do some work in eye temperature. If you have been to the Texas Panhandle or really any of the Great Plains, it is notably windy and dusty. So collecting blink rate, which is some people have had success with, is really difficult because you're constantly blinking. So some of the measures are very situationally available to us. So understanding horse welfare really actually does come down to sustainability. And I say that because we're looking at a horse, again, that's living for 30 plus years. They deserve a quality of life. We are in the stage, though, that we are only knowing or looking at what's adverse in their life. We're not yet to the stage where we are really promoting positive welfare. So we're a good 20, 30 years behind some of the other species like cattle on thinking about our equine welfare. But at minimum, it's a financially sustainable option. If we can find ways to keep our horses alive, we can decrease vet bills, we can decrease that medical cost, we can decrease turnover. It can have some environmental impact. I do have a citation for that one. So if horses actually have adequate pasture, we see that the nitrogen distribution from those horses can be quite good. And then certainly there's social sustainability. Typically the response when you have to euthanize a horse is not, oh, good, what are we doing with that horse afterwards? Nobody is at all interested in that part of the process. And so at least minimally socially, we owe it to these animals also to ask questions about their welfare and work towards it. I do think that there's a future in equine welfare, and these are the things I think we are moving towards. And so that is actually one of my students as well. She is, so the way we collect saliva on horses is we actually use tampons, the great cotton pads. You get a bunch of saliva, spin them down, and you got a great sample. So for any of you with cattle, pigs, horses, and you need saliva, highly recommend tampons. They look great. So we need to address these lameness and behavioral issues we're seeing in these equine assisted services. We also need to find ways to be asking these horses before it becomes severe. They shouldn't have to get to the point where we are having, kind of explosions, if you will. We should find these early interventions or early signs. Our lab is doing some counter training at the moment to try and train horses to have choice, to have reactivity, to try and have responses on cue. So we can maybe ask the horse, do you want to be led from the head or from behind today? Or do you want to engage in like a mounted activity, or should we try and do a ground activity? So we're trying to get into those stages where we can maybe ask them so that these sessions can still occur. And so there is my next, creating opportunities for choice. And then the last thing that we really need is decisions based on science. A lot of equine management is going to be anecdotal at this stage. And so we need to start having some level of baseline. I was talking the other night about how I always remember listening to some fish welfare scientists who are saying, do we need to put in a plastic tree or no plastic tree? And I think in some ways that's where we're at with horses is, do I need to put in like a plastic ball or no plastic ball? And just kind of getting some of that foundational work done. Oops, it went backwards. The other thing I will say is our technology needs validation. Horses have all this technology that exists, and somehow, well, probably not somehow, these companies keep going belly up. They keep going bankrupt. So we have these really great gait analysis softwares that can potentially be a good help, especially thinking about lameness. There are pads we can put underneath saddles that we're working with right now to try and see rider balance. So asking the question, how does rider balance influence gait on horses? And there are some rein sensors available as well. So we can look at, use physics to see input to that horse. Every single one of these pieces that are in my lab, though, those companies no longer exist. And there's new companies, but we can't figure out, what's available, who exists, whatever. So if any of you are really great physics engineers who like to do like input work, have I got questions that I could use help with? So we barely can even validate this stuff before it goes off the market. And so I do think the world of equine welfare is growing. And just in case, this is one of the prettier views of the Panhandle. We do have a canyon, and so this would be in the fall when things are actually looking quite nice. But I do think that the world is growing. There's entire conferences based on equine welfare. We, of course, have some research going on in Europe that can also help guide us to kind of help us make these decisions. And so at the end, I just want to say thank you. Certainly, this is my lab. As I mentioned, I actually broke my collarbone. So this was them last year trying to help us take a photo. We always do an annual Christmas card. So this was last year's photos. I am up at the vet school, so we're certainly there with those dogs and cats. But thank you all. Hopefully I left you at least with some questions to ask. And I think we have time for questions, I assume, correct? Okay, so I'll turn those over. Thank you.
Does anyone in the audience have any questions?
We do also have a break, so if you'd rather talk privately, I'm certainly available for that too.
I have some virtual questions.
You have questions? Okay, let's talk about them.
I have a question about the cribbing. Did you look at that yourself, or did you just read?
No, I did not look at cribbing myself. There's a pretty big body of data on cribbing specific to racehorses, but no, I have not.
Yeah, I was just interested from personal experience was with horses that perform that behavior. How do you know if it's a habit from a previous stress before, or if it's a result of a current stress right now?
That's a really great question. So one thing that I always remind, at least my students, because I certainly teach too, is that stereotypies don't happen overnight. So the best chance you would have to know that is watching how long the onset is. If the horse pretty much shows up and starts cribbing, you're dealing with probably a previous behavioral pattern, which might indicate that the current livelihood is actually quite good. They just previously developed this compensation behavior. You typically will see it start to develop. And in my anecdotal experience with cribbers, you see them start to explore substrates, they start to put their mouth on things, and you start to then slowly see it more and more over time. So you can watch it kind of almost start to happen on you. Yeah, so that'll be my answer to that question.
Thank you.
Yeah. And while she's walking, there's a lot of research. If you take away cribbing, putting on cribbing collars, the stress is extremely high, and that horses will actually work and preference just as much to crib as they will for any food source. So cribbing is quite a desirable behavior once it's established. Shauna.
So I love technology.
I do too.
And we also deal with the companies not manufacturing what we need anymore soon after we buy it. But if you could have the ideal sensor, the sensor of all sensors, where would you put it? What would it measure? And which behaviors would you correlate it with?
Yeah, so a sensor I was trying to purchase had 7 points, I think, and 9 points. So there was one on the pole of the horse, the withers, the back, and then 2 on each leg. And so it was going to map the horse in space. And I was jazzed for this thing, because if any of you have had to sit at a computer and watch behavior, pushing the little owl, big owl repetitively is really annoying, and you might fall asleep and lose some undergrads in the process. So if I could map the horse in space, that would have been amazing. But that company doesn't exist anymore. So that would have been nice. I do think that these pressure pads could be really neat in relationship specifically to equine assisted services. I'm not sure how much I trust them yet. I need to figure out some good validation because they seem to be picking up way too much input. And so we'll see kind of what we can do with it. But I think they are overrepresenting the input to the horse, or yeah, because there's no way, I mean, a leg doesn't, leg isn't 2 feet wide. So, yeah, thigh.
So the whole body in space sensor you should work with a video game programmer, right? Don't like the movies people where they create the CGI.
It's very true.
Mhm.
I do enjoy some coding, but yeah.
Well, the collaboration.
One of the technologies we have in hoists is we have something called Pixio camera, which is a little fussy, but it actually does map the hoist. So we can put a camera in the arena, and as the hoist moves around it, it just follows and zooms in and out on that hoist. So to all of my cattle, I don't know how well a chicken would work. Maybe you need a full-size sow, but that at least helps with one job. It does track them. So that's at least nice. I will say, to give one credit to technology, I can at least track an animal in space.
Hey, Nicole, very interesting talk.
Thanks.
For those horses that are used for equine assisted therapies,
Yeah.
is there like a program to evaluate the suitability, or is it a situation where there's so few of them?
So it's not that there's so few, it's that nobody has any criteria. So there is path. You should be an accredited center. If you or a loved one or anyone in your life goes to a center to receive and serve equine assisted services, make sure they're accredited. That's a bare minimum that you need to be reaching. Beyond that, those are lists of some suggestions. Some centers will put them in maybe a few weeks isolation. Some will say, can we catch them in a pen? Some will say, we'll actually put them through rigor. It just depends on the center and the desirability, but there's not like a national evaluation at all.
Right. And then I was also wondering, because you mentioned, so those horses are used to receiving input from the rider, but then you have the handler and they're expected to pay attention to the handler. So is there anyone looking into kind of the disconnect there in terms of when those behavioral issues are happening, kicking, biting, and so on? Is anyone looking at kind of the disconnect between the input from the rider versus the handler, and where's that horse focusing its attention?
Yeah, so I have two answers to that. One, we did run a study using college students and just have them lead horses through the mazes. If I recall, all the college students thought the sessions went great. Based on the behavioral coding, some of them went okay. So depending on the skills of the handler, they may not be seeing anything. They might be like, this is amazing, I got to do this. Because you're working with volunteers, many are there because they believe in the mission for the humans. They're not often there because they're heavily trained in horses. The other thing that I do have sitting on my desk that I need to figure out how to run is we've been doing a lot of lag time. So from the time that I ask you to walk on or halt, how long does it take for that horse to actually react, and try and use that as a metric. And so we have that all actively going on. And some of it's just sitting on my desk waiting for the next step. Yeah.
This is probably a dumb question, so I apologize if it is.
Such thing.
But you said that most of the times that you're looking at horses as this equine assisted as a second career. Has there been any work, or is anybody, if the horse starts young, as we were learning about earlier this morning, if it's trained from a young age to take part in this?
That's the best question, because those horses do beautifully. So if a center gets donated a horse that happens to be 3 or 4 and they have the capacity to train, those horses actually have none of these signs of burnout. They have no kicking and biting problems, and they seem to do quite well and can stay with the centers till they're 20. But that's maybe a 5% population of the EAS horses. So if you happen to have a young horse and you want to do a tax break, donate it to an EAS center. You guys don't laugh at my jokes. It seems to be unwanted, and it seems to be or they are horses that come out of these high performance centers that it is a tax break to donate them. And so instead of having a horse that is going to cost them input or no longer serves their goals, they can pass it on. Sometimes they are a child's horse that now the child's in college, so they go off. It's a handful of ways. They're not like going to auction and buying them. They are actively hand to hand, donated. So they're not actually like to that level of auction horses.
So going off of the EAS horses, do they have a set schedule of like what they do throughout the day, if it's only assisting individuals who need help, or do they mix it in just to make sure those stressors don't happen so frequently?
Yeah, so it absolutely depends on the center. Some centers will have maybe 3 horses that do EAS, and then they might also use them in like normal riding lessons as another generator for income. Those horses, the recommendations say up to 6 hours of work. So 6 hours is pretty substantial. Some of them they do get days off. My experience thus far with sensors is really what happens is you might be on the schedule 4 times today, but there's always somebody that cancels. So the schedule is quite variable. Some sensors will have a day where they get ridden. So there was one sensor I went to in Dallas that they have all, everybody that volunteers is allowed a lesson day. And so they'll use those horses in a lesson with a balanced rider to give them kind of a counterbalancing. Some of them will do warm-up periods. Some of them just walk the horse right into the arena and hop on and go. So it's all really mixed on what a work day looks like for those animals.
Can I ask one more question?
Of course.
Is regarding the heart rate variability.
Mhm.
In your literature search, you say that a low heart rate variability is indicative of more stress. right?
Yes.
In human athletes, a low value for heart rate variability is considered a good thing.
Okay.
But did the research look into the fitness of the horses? Like an advancing horse would be more fit, say, than like a EAS horse?
So what heart rate variability should be measuring is sympathetic and parasympathetic activity. So, I mean, fitness shouldn't be as critical in that parasympathetic, sympathetic. I don't know the data. I know we've used it also in pigs and horses, pigs and cattle. Also, we use HRV. Because I've had students ask me, because they have bands that also say like you have low and good. And so I'm wondering if those systems translate it so that we can understand what those numbers mean. Because in general, what you want is actually the system to be primed and ready for a sympathetic parasympathetic switch. So that's what high heart rate variability gives us. So yeah, I wonder if it's just the coding of those systems. I don't know.
I was thinking maybe a low value would be you're able to cope with the stress more. You're
Yeah.
used to that stress. So
Fair enough.
There's quite a bit of variation.
Yeah, there's tons of individual variations as well. Yeah, and I had a student who was very excited / unexcited. So I teach veterinary students to tell me always what her heart rate variability was for the 3 days leading up to an exam. And then the next night she'd be like, okay, I've been tracking this for you, which is always kind of fun as an instructor, but sad to watch because she would always show me her sleep scores and her heart rate variability, and they were always terrible, right? Especially physiology exams. Anyway,
Questions? All right, let's.
cool. Thank you, everybody.